during this time of the coronavirus, as we're seeing death toll around the world increasing dramatically. And as we worry for ourselves and for our families and for our communities, many of us may start asking about where is God in all of this? And how can God allow this kind of suffering to take place? We think of God as a good God. We think of him as one who loves us passionately and extravagantly. And yet, in this context that we're in right now, globally, throughout the world, we may start to seriously ask these kind of questions around how can God allow this suffering to continue? And where is he in all of this? These questions are part of a body of theology called Theodicy, which is trying to answer that basic question of how can a good God allow bad things to happen to people? And there has been a great deal of theologizing in order to try and answer this question. And Augustine has done pretty good work on that, and I'll put on the blog, I'll put a picture of Augustine's answer to this question. But really these answers are so sort of intellectual. They try to provide explanations based on theology and scripture for why it is that God would allow bad things to happen to us. They don't really answer the question that we have in our heart, which is, where is God in all of this? And so the pastoral answer is quite different from the theological answer. Last year, a good friend, a colleague of mine, died in a freak accident. She was quite young. She left behind young children. And when we were at her funeral, one of my other colleagues, a very close friend of hers, came to me and said, "Adrian, do you have some wise words for me?" And I completely choked up. I couldn't answer her question at all. All I could do was to weep with her and hold her. Afterwards, I thought of all these clever things that I should have said to her. But when I look back on it now, I think that response was the most appropriate response that I could have made, which is simply to be with her in the midst of her grief. When people ask this difficult question about where is God during suffering, when they ask me that question, I find that there's really just two things that I can say. And the first is this, that God is always present with us when we suffer. God is imminently, closely present with us and immersed with us in these painful moments. We see this, I think, in the story of Lazarus, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead in John chapter 11, where Jesus stands at the tomb with the family and his friends and the crowds, and he weeps as he stands in front of the tomb, and Lazarus has already been dead now for a few days. The theologians offer all kinds of clever explanations as to why he was weeping, but I think most fundamentally Jesus was weeping because he was in solidarity with the family who were weeping. He was sharing in their grief and their sorrow and their dismay at the loss of this man that they loved so much. And I think in a similar kind of way, whenever we are weeping, whenever we are grieving or suffering, Jesus is standing with us, and he grieves and weeps and suffers along with us. He is present with us in our sufferings. There's that great song of Meddler from a few decades ago, which I always loved, "From a Distance." God is watching us from a distance. It's a beautiful song, but it's really terrible theology, particularly for Christians, because God is not at a distance. He is rather close. He is what we call immanent. He's present. He's right here with me. I can almost feel him here, just at my shoulder. The incarnation of the Son of God into the human being who we know as Jesus of Nazareth is a sign and a great example of God's closeness to us. God comes right into our space And he dwells with us as a human being, not just as a God who's remote, who watches and who understands and cares, but as a God who becomes a person just like us and who experiences all of the joys and also all of the sorrows that it is to be human. And we see this most profoundly on the cross. When Jesus dies, God experiences something God has never experienced before. God has never experienced death. Until the death of Jesus on the cross, God did not know truly experientially in his own experience what death was like. But since the death of Christ, God understands what it is like to die. And so we can be sure of this, friends, that when we are suffering, when life is hard, and we feel that God has somehow abandoned us, we can know that he is in fact right next to us. And that what we feel, he feels. And that he is both grieved and angered by the suffering that we experience in this world. The second thing that I try to think about when people are suffering, and when I am suffering, although this is usually something I wouldn't say right away, is that God is able to turn all the bad experiences that we have around. He's like a craftsman who can take the most broken, the most ugly, the most fragile and dysfunctional thing and is able to transform it into something beautiful. Paul writes about this in Romans 8, where he says that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and who walk according to his will. God takes all of the things that we experience, all of the suffering and the badness and our sinfulness and our brokenness and our turning away from Godness. He takes all of these things and he somehow weaves them together like a potter or a tapestry weaver into something that is beautiful and good, something that can transform and grow us. When we're in the midst of suffering, that may bring little comfort. But as we journey through suffering and into the life after suffering, as we try to make sense of it, we can begin to recognize that God is able to bring something good and beautiful out of things that are bad. This work of God does not mean that these bad things are good. It's not some kind of distortion of the bad, that the bad actually is good. The bad things, the ways in which we suffer, the ways in which the world is broken, remain broken and suffering and sad and bad. But it is through those things and out of those things that God is able to give birth to something that is good and beautiful. And we see this perhaps again most clearly in the cross. The cross was fundamentally bad. We, humankind, destroyed God the Son. We endeavored to execute and murder him. There's nothing good about what we did. And yet through that event which is so fundamentally dysfunctional and sinful and violent, God gave birth to the forgiveness of humankind and made salvation possible for all of us. He took this terrible experience of suffering that the Son of God experienced, and he brought something beautiful out of it, which is the potential for the reconciliation of the entire creation under the headship of Jesus Christ. And so when I'm going through hard times, and I've been through painful times in my life, I now and then come and remind myself of this truth that even these bad things can be turned around for good. So friends, as we perhaps grapple with this question of where is God in all of this, and as we see thousands and thousands of people dying around the world, and as many of us are shut down in our houses and our homes, and as many of us have family who work in health and in social services and in emergency services and have to put their lives on the risk every day as they go out to work with people who are ill, let us remember these two deep truths about God. First, that God is always with us. In the midst and the most darkest times, God is present with us. And secondly, that even through the worst experiences, God is able to give birth to something that is good and beautiful. And so I want to encourage you to keep turning back towards God. As we lose faith in him, let us recover that faith and turn back towards him. As we question him, let's ask those questions, and then let's turn back to him to say, but God, you are here. And so I wish you strength, and I wish you the assurance of God's presence during these dark times.